Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of A Manic Odyssey. I am here with Dr. Kiki Fehling, and we are going to talk about all things DBT and how that interacts with both of our lives. Dr. Fehling has some incredible resources that we're going to talk about today. She also is someone who's spreading the good news of DBT on social media. That is how we connected. And if you haven't checked out her stuff, I'll be sure to link that in this episode description as well. Kiki, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've been so excited for this conversation after following you on TikTok and Instagram for so long.
Yes. Well, let's just start there. Like, you're also on TikTok and Instagram. How did that journey start for you? When did you get introduced to DBT? Like, what does that look like?
Okay, so maybe like to go the furthest back. So I am a licensed psychologist and I earned my PhD at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And while I was at Rutgers, I studied clinically under Dr. Shireen Rizvi, who was works there and specializes in DBT. And so basically, for most of my graduate school training, I was providing DBT and being supervised in DBT. So I'm a very early convert to DBT in terms of my clinical life.
Yeah.
I love it and um, primarily provided DBT when I was working as a licensed therapist after graduating. So I am all about DBT, CBT, evidence-based mental health treatments and information. And I remember, I think it was shortly before 2020, I read an article about how many Gen Zers in particular, but a lot of even millennials and a lot of folks were actually using TikTok as a way to get health information. And so I went on TikTok and I like looked around at the DBT stuff and I was like, okay, I'm not sure about everything here, but I want to be a part of this conversation. If this is where people are going to learn about DBT, I'd like to make sure that they're getting the information that I know to be correct because of
Yeah.
my expertise.
Yeah.
And then I loved it. It ended up being a lot of fun and I enjoyed connecting with people. And so now I still do that.
Yes. Yeah, no, I love your videos. They're very like like I said before we started talking, like there are things that I want to talk about because I had never heard of some of these concepts or the way you were
Yeah.
presenting them. And that is a great asset for somebody who has the clinical experience versus somebody who has the life
Mhm.
experience. Like both of our contributions to how DBT's experiences are important. The difference is in my videos, I disclaim not an expert, not a
Yeah.
clinical psychologist or therapist. So therefore, take what I'm saying and then go apply it to somebody like yourself who can clinically tell you whether or not what you're saying is true or false. Why is it more, why can it be more effective to see it presented in some of these TikTok forms than in a more clinical traditional setting?
Yeah. I mean, straight up, it's more accessible. I like, as I'm assuming you know, DVT can be quite expensive.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
And beyond that, it's a very comprehensive therapy that requires a lot of training on behalf of the therapist. And so even that makes DBT like delivered according to the original like well-researched model, like makes it
Yeah.
hard to find. There aren't as many therapists as people who need
Yeah.
DBT.
Yes.
So that is also the main reason why I like got on social media and wrote my book and things like that. But I think that's the thing that makes social media so effective. It just puts this information out there so that people even know it exists. And then I think DBT, compared to some other therapies, is really like lends itself really well to the short form content that's
Hmm.
necessary on social media, like the 90-second videos, right?
Yeah.
You actually can teach some DBT skills in 90 seconds.
Yeah.
And so there aren't many mental health things that you can actually get a huge bang for your buck in 90 seconds. So I think that obviously accessibility, dissemination, but then TikTok, things you do, things I try to do, make it fun and entertaining. And that makes people remember it. And beyond like a 2 hour DBT skills class, as much as I love it, it can
Yeah.
just be more accessible for folks.
Yes, 100% agree. And yeah, you're preaching to the choir over here. It was a brutal experience finding affordable DBT
Yeah.
care because it's two ends of the spectrum. There's like, at least in California, there's two ends of the spectrum. You either have no income or low income, and there's a lot of resources for you, or you have a ton of income and there's a lot of resources for you. But if you're in between those two
Hmm.
extremes, it becomes very challenging. And so I ended up going back and forth with my insurance for months. It took a behemoth effort on my part, my partner's part, friends. Like it was
Mhm.
a full thing. And so I like what you're saying with the 90-second videos, because what's hilarious is like, yes, I think every crisis survival skill can be taught in 90 seconds. Right? Like you could go through each one and be like, here's how you do progressive muscle relaxation. Here's how you do the tip skills in 90 seconds or less. And now you have a skill forever that you can go
Yeah.
back to. And what I love about social media is that you can save these skills, right? That you can save them in like a playlist and be like, I can go back to my TikTok and find I'm in a low headspace playlist and watch these videos. I wanted to go back to the fact that you had such an early introduction to DBT compared to what I've heard with other people who don't find it until after grad school. And usually
Uh-huh.
accidentally in like a clinical rehabilitation center or some group therapy where they didn't know that DBT was being taught. So, what was that like to get it at such a pivotal stage in your education?
I mean, it was amazing. I think, I mean, I know I'm preaching the choir here too, but like I love DBT as a theoretical framework, like just a framework and philosophy of therapy. It provides so many life skills. And its dialectical stance of recognizing that lots of different people have lots of different opinions and finding truth requires you to like think dialectically and flexibly. It
Yep.
just resonated as true for me.
Yeah.
So it deeply impacted all of my clinical training and clinical choices and my personal life. But then also, I don't know, DBT is so non-judgmental.
Yeah.
It's so effective.
Right.
And it offers so many tools as a therapist, just like it offers so many tools for clients. So it really makes you a better therapist, let alone a better person, in my opinion, just by learning DBT so early. You're able to implement everything else you might be learning in clinical work. It also allows you to help a really big group of people, which isn't always true for every therapy. And
Yes.
I felt comfortable in my third year of grad school working with folks that other seasoned clinicians would not feel comfortable working with because of suicidality or something like that. And
Yep.
that's a big
Yep.
shame
Yep.
because those people need help.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, that's very true. I think speaking to I have friends who are more are psychodynamic in their approach. We have a lot of conversations about the necessity of certain therapies, certain modalities for certain individuals. And what I like to say is DBT is not a replacement for psychotherapy. It is an accessory, just like psychotherapy is an accessory to DBT. In fact, I can't remember if we talked about this, but I think of DBT as the what and the how, and psychodynamic as the why, right? Like we get the what do I have to do and how do I have to do it to be effective so I can tolerate life and not suffer? Well, great. Here's all these skills. Like, well, do you want to go deep? No, I don't want to go deep. I don't want to think about why I'm doing this. I just want to tolerate life and get out of this suffering place. Great. Here's all these skills. Now you know how to tolerate life and you have interpersonal skills and emotion regulation skills and crisis survival skills. Hey, now that you
Mhm.
have all these skills, do you want to go talk about your childhood for the next, 3 years of your life? You can if you'd like, because you can tolerate the difficult trauma that's probably going to come up because of all these skills you have. Has that kind of been
Mhm.
true to your experience?
100%. I do think that's accurate that DBT is a great first step for a lot of people to do other types of psychotherapy. I will add one caveat that you did not say this, so I don't mean to imply that, but there is a misconception about DBT. And something that maybe I can tell you or other listeners about is that DBT actually has four stages.
Yeah.
And the first stage is what we call behavioral control and is
Mhm.
really focused on what you're talking about. Like, let's learn these skills, focus on how can we help you stop doing these behaviors that are hurting you? How can we help you do the things that you want to do in your life?
Yeah.
And stage two is actually designed to help folks with trauma. Um,
Interesting.
yeah. And stage
Okay.
three and four are less studied, but are all about like how can we help you find happiness, sustained meaning, and like sustained peace, essentially, and joy. So it can get at the bigger picture stuff, and it is still DBT, but it does look pretty different than stage one. And to be fair, I do think I'm even one of them. I often refer folks out to other therapists after we finish stage one and or stage two because I am trained in trauma therapy, so I can do stage two.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I so
That's good to know. No, that's
yeah,
helpful. That's helpful. That's like a very helpful caveat and nuance, and still very dialectical because
yes,
what I'm hearing you say is that there are clinicians like yourself who have trauma-informed therapy, so they could take someone into stage two and three and four, while other
correct.
clinicians might lack some of that more trauma-informed therapy. So therefore, to be most effective, they would stop after stage one and then refer out
Yes.
to. So, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. I also, yeah, on that same vein, your workbook, self-directed DBT skills. Oh, it's blurred, but you can see it, everybody. You know what it looks like. Oh, there you go.
There
Yeah.
we go.
Perfect. Boom. Self-directed DBT skills. 3-month DBT workbook. Regulate intense emotions and create lasting change with dialectical behavior therapy. What was it that made you want to do a 3-month DBT workbook instead of the more traditional 6 months or a year? And how did you cultivate this plan before we even get to the cool cards? Because we will.
Totally. Yeah. So my coworker Ellie and I went with 3 months for two main reasons. One, again, the accessibility thing. Like,
Mhm.
I think that 3 months or 12 weeks is feels way more attainable and more attractive to commit to than 6 months for some people.
Yeah.
And especially in workbook form where you don't have a therapist helping you like maintain motivation and stay consistent. And I don't know, it's kind of we narrowed it down for that main reason. But then and also there is some research that says DBT can help some people in shorter amounts of time.
Mm.
It depends on what the study is and what exactly skills they're including, but 12 weeks, 3 months is one of the like the time periods that some folks can feel a change. So it felt like an easier way to just be like, this is like what DBT can offer,
Yeah.
and here's a taster to see if it helps you.
Yeah, yeah. So this is like for some people this will be enough, and for others it will open the door to what
Yeah,
they to more support in DBT.
yeah,
Cool, cool. Yeah, it's interesting too because DBT is can be so flexible, right? Like there is the comprehensive full DBT experience with phone coaching and team consult and group and individual. And then there is just DBT groups, skills group and substance recovery centers or
yes.
hospitals, right? Where they're just this, it's just the skills group. And I work for a psychoeducation online program where they're just teaching the skills, like
Oh,
just the life skills, and it's not comprehensive. It's just 1 hour in one group a week, but it's autonomous learning throughout the week, and then we talk about the skill for an hour. And it's
amazing.
less, yeah, and it's less therapeutic and more coaching. Like it's more like how can we troubleshoot what worked and what didn't work? And we say that a lot. We're not therapists, so please be aware because there is a certain level of harm that will come if you
Mhm.
try to be therapeutic without the skills that are required to be effectively therapeutic. And I think that friends of people who have mental illness know this well because they try to do things that they believe are effective and they end up reinforcing certain negative behaviors and then burning themselves out because they don't know what the heck is going on or what they're doing. I'll never forget my phone
Mhm.
coach explaining to me why I had to call them before engaging in self-harm behavior, right? Having that conversation about why it was so important and why it wasn't a invalidation that they weren't going to keep talking to me when I called after. It was to
Mhm.
protect and build the scale moving forward.
Mhm.
Right? That's not
Mhm.
something that a friend is going to intuitively know if they're not also going through grad school or have somebody in their life who's doing that. Mind
No.
you, in my opinion, a good friend or an effective friend will look up what that means and how to support someone. There are plenty of online resources to tell you what to do and how to do it. So I'm not going to give everybody a free pass on like, I'm not friends with this person anymore because they're difficult to deal with. It's like a lot of people are difficult to deal with. We have skills and we have resources for those people. In fact, that difficult person is probably looking for somebody to finally meet them where they're at and be effective
Yes.
instead of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So
Yeah.
keeping that in mind, this seems like a great tool. Damn my blur. There we go. This seems like a great tool for friends and family. Oh, look at that.
Yes.
To just quickly pull out the card, get an
Yeah.
idea for what it is that their friend or family member might be going through, and then learn the skill themselves. So, what brought you to this brilliant card idea?
Yeah. So this one I cannot remotely take credit for. This is all about my clients and the folks who read my workbook. I like there were a number of people who after the workbook reached out to me saying, thank you and loved this, loved that. But that like one of the things that I kept hearing people say is they were making flashcards for themselves. and like taking things into their therapists and things like that. And so, in addition to that, I've previously had clients who said, like, are there flashcards you recommend for memorizing all of these acronyms?
Yeah, yeah,
So it felt like a good, easy way to like support people who wanted to do that. And then the other thing that I know that you and I have talked about a little bit is DBT can be super helpful for neurodivergent folks when it's delivered in a neuroaffirmative way.
yeah,
And I've also received feedback from some neurodivergent people that like the workbook is like too much text. Like it's too big, it's kind of scary.
yeah,
And that's not inherent to being neurodivergent, to be clear, but those folks might have more like school trauma or difficulties with reading for various reasons in the past.
yeah.
Um, and like attention is difficult with reading a lot of the time. And
Totally, totally.
so the cards were also trying to create a way, almost like TikTok and Instagram, right? Like bite-sized information
Yeah,
that can still help you um, when you don't want to do a full workbook, when you don't have access to real DBT. Just can we give you something like do what works, right?
yeah,
Do something that's effective, even if it can't help you all of the way that we comprehensive DBT might be able to.
yeah, yeah. And you have more experience than I do working with autistic individuals who want to utilize the skills. What is
Mhm.
it that neurotypical individuals or people who are more on like the socially acceptable neurodivergent spectrum are missing when trying to communicate the skills to people who are autistic? Like
Oh,
where is the disconnect when I'm like, do the skill and they're like, that's hard. Like the fast skill is hard. It's like, well, why is it hard? Right? So what is it that I'm missing as a more neurotypical person that someone who's autistic might be like, here, if I could say this to you, this is what it would be.
yeah, totally. So I will say it will probably depend on what skill you're teaching
Right.
and what neurotype the person you're talking to has, because neurodivergence includes autism, ADHD, learning disorders, OCD, lots of different types of um, cognitive psychological experiences,
Yeah.
not just autism versus allistic.
Yes.
And so, for someone who is autistic, for example, one of the main things that I've had to change in teaching, according to like the traditional manual, is like some of the, I mean, it's funny you bring up fast skills, but like some of the interpersonal effectiveness is straight up neurotypical, like and ableist in the expectations of like you must make eye contact, for
Yeah.
example.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right.
And so, like for FAST and for Dear Man, effectiveness skills, so these are the skills for increasing assertiveness and maintaining self-respect for folks who don't know, to not try to use acronyms only.
Yes.
Like, we encourage folks to appear confident by making eye contact, which for most allistic and neurotypical folks is going to be effective and useful. But if you are autistic, eye contact might be uncomfortable for you. Or if the person you're speaking to is autistic, eye contact might be uncomfortable for them. So just kind of being more aware of when you're teaching it that people have different lived experiences of what emotions are like, of what interpersonal effectiveness actually looks like within people, within themselves and the people they talk to,
Yeah.
or I should say communicate with even. And so I think it's just bringing awareness to taking feedback.
Yeah.
And when you're teaching, like the most neuroaffirmative thing you can do, I think, without like really getting to know someone in their lived experience, is
Yeah.
as you teach, say, does this make sense to you? Does this
Yeah.
feel possible for you? Like,
Yeah.
does this sound like it'd be effective? What am I missing?
Yeah.
So I could probably come up with some other specific skills and examples of how it might differ for some neurodivergent people. Um, oh, I did a recent video about pathological demand avoidance.
Yes.
Should I talk about that?
Yes, please. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Okay. So pathological demand avoidance, which also known as PDA as the acronym, but also known as persistent drive for autonomy. So
I
there,
loved that
demand
definition. The persistent drive for autonomy. That hit me right in the heart. I was like, "Oh shit.
oh yeah,
I didn't even know this had a
yeah,
label, which is very
yeah.
helpful."
Yeah, so to be clear, PDA is not in like the DSM or ICD. At least I'm pretty sure it's not. As I say that. And pathological demand avoidance is the term that's usually used in like research so far and like in IAPs and things like that. But persistent drive for autonomy is more what some people who experience this prefer because it
Yeah,
does sound more neuroaffirmative. Like, yeah, there's not something wrong with me. This
yeah,
is how I am.
yeah.
So, okay. So PDA is this like inner experience of having a really deep aversion to demands being placed on you.
Hmm.
So it is exactly what PDA says, persistent drive for autonomy. Like I prioritize self-respect and self and like autonomy as much as I can. That's like high up on my values list.
Yeah, yeah.
And so for a lot of folks with PDA, which is common in autism, but there are folks who have the experience of PDA who are not autistic. And that experience can make learning DBT skills super hard in all sorts of ways because it feels like a demand. My
Yeah,
DBT therapist is telling me, do this thing, it's good for you.
yeah,
And then you're like,
yeah.
immediately just like, F you.
Triggered. Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
But where this can really come up is in the skill of opposite action, where
Ooh,
all of the, yeah, you can imagine, right? All of a
yes.
sudden, it's like you have a desire through your emotion to do something.
Yeah.
Talk about a demand for someone to tell you, well, just do the opposite. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
really just like the definition of difficult, I think.
Yeah.
But in my video, something that I offer to folks, if you've had that experience, even if you don't have PDA, if you've often been like, you know what, like, F you, like, I'm going to do what I want with my emotion, I'm going to follow my emotions, which is sometimes very effective, obviously. Um, a useful reframe is that when we are feeling emotions intensely, when we are in emotion mind, it's not actually our wisest, truest self who's in control and making the decisions. It's that emotion. So we
Mhm.
can think about that action urge of that emotion. What is that
Yeah.
emotion making me feel like doing as a demand in
Yeah.
and of itself? And so it can be useful to say, like, actually, I have autonomy. I don't have to listen to you, emotion. You're just a part of my experience making a demand on me, and I can still choose to do what I want.
Wow.
That reframe isn't going to be useful for everyone,
Yeah.
but it can be a useful one for some folks.
That's super useful. I love that reframe. We've
Yeah.
also been touching on the idea of neurodiversity, and I'm wondering because I really am grateful that you clarified some of the like you clarified, hey, autistic people are not the only thing that exists on the
Yeah.
neurodivergent spectrum. Would you just kind of shed some light on what it is when somebody's like, hey, there's this thing called neurodivergency and there is this thing called neurotypicalness. What is
Yes.
that? Like, what is that for us to know?
Totally. Okay. So yeah, I love this. Okay. So neurodiversity is just like this larger framework of understanding that there are different neurotypes. And so neurotypes are, as I said, kind of like cognitive and psychological ways of experiencing the world.
Hmm.
Experiencing your body, experiencing your mind. They're just like different lenses. Maybe a really concrete one that's useful is there's something called face blindness, which
Hmm.
is, have you heard of this?
I have heard of face blindness, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a neurotype where some people literally like can't perceive and remember other people's faces.
Hmm.
So most people can see and remember faces and use faces to identify people.
Yeah.
People who are face blind cannot. And it's like very difficult as a person who can see and encode faces not to be able to imagine someone
Yeah.
who can't,
Yeah.
and vice versa,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that's a really concrete example of why it's useful to recognize that actually people have different cognitive and psychological experiences that are based at like a biological level, like different neurotypes. And neurodiversity is a framework that helps us understand that that exists, that
Yeah.
people are diverse
Yeah.
in their neurotype. So from there, neurotypical is kind of a really big umbrella term for folks whose neurotype fit within the like societal standard
Hmm.
of what we think most people's inner experiences are like. So
Hmm.
this is allistic, which is the opposite of autistic. This is folks who don't have learning disorders, folks who don't have OCD, folks who can see faces, right?
Yeah.
The kinds of things that we normally think about as quote unquote normal,
Yeah.
but we use typical just to mean like statistically more likely to
Yeah.
happen and
Yeah.
prioritized by our cultures most of the time.
Yeah.
Neurodivergent is everything else. It's any kind of neurotype that doesn't fit into a
Mm.
neurotypical understanding, according to our current society. So neurodivergence, and like neurodivergent identities include autism, ADHD, all of those things I mentioned, but not just those two. 'Cause sometimes I think it can be misused to just mean ADHD, essentially.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, you caught me in that kind of that tongue twister moment of like,
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking specifically autistic people, and when we're talking
Uh-huh.
about neurodivergent, it's like, well, we must mean mostly, probably autistic people. So you're saying that on that spectrum, right? We're talking about OCD, we're talking about ADHD, we're talking about autism. Are we also talking about certain psychological disorders? Are we talking about things like in
Yeah.
the cluster Bs that would be considered kind of in that spectrum? And then follow-up question to that before you answer it. With certain disorders like borderline personality disorder, where you can heal certain symptoms over time, does that
Mhm.
then make you any less neurodivergent, or is it more just you've coped with your neurodivergency in a more effective way?
Yeah. Oh gosh, great questions. Okay. So if I miss one of them, let me know. But
Okay.
so I will say it depends who you talk to, but I think that most people these days are starting to lean towards recognizing like DSM diagnoses, even though there are some problems with that,
Just
obviously,
a,
for
just
some
a
folks,
little.
especially in our diversity movement,
Yeah.
that they are under the umbrella, and
Yeah.
would be like neurodivergent, like experiences. I think that something that's useful to point out is there is an understanding of there being a difference between neurodivergent neurotypes that you are born with
Hmm.
and neurodivergent neurotypes that are acquired.
Yes.
So like
Okay.
traumatic brain injury
Right.
or even just being through chronic trauma
Right.
can change your biology such that it might change your neurotype.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think BPD is a particularly useful example to discuss within the neurodivergent umbrella because, yeah, even with DBT, we see a huge shift in symptoms for folks where all of
Yep.
a sudden their difficulties in life go way down and
Yep.
then they don't meet criteria anymore. And they may not even relate to the diagnosis anymore
Yeah.
after successful treatment.
Yeah.
But if you're in DBT, you often learn the biosocial model
Right.
of how emotion dysregulation and BPD develops.
Yep.
And oh my gosh, that itself could be a whole podcast. But
Yes.
briefly, right? Like it's the bio and the social, the bio part refers to there's the theory that folks who are diagnosed with BPD and other types of emotional difficulties in general actually might often are biologically emotionally sensitive.
Right.
So they feel emotions more easily, they feel emotions more intensely, they feel emotions for longer periods of time than your average person. And that does seem to be biologically based, and often folks are born with that.
Yeah.
So there's lots of talk that that is a type of neurodivergence.
Mm.
That like that emotional vulnerability, that
Yeah.
biological emotional sensitivity. Actually, I have had a number of clients more recently start to identify as neurodivergent, mostly because of that experience of just
Yeah.
like other people clearly do not feel emotions the way that I feel them. Like
Yeah. Totally.
I'm not typical in that way. So,
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for shining light on that. That makes a
yeah.
lot of sense and adds definitely necessary clarity. We
Yeah.
already talked about the PDA, which I find to be such an illuminating experience because I feel that in my body, like just that
Mm.
inherent, almost like a protective fuck you. Like I am not going to let you take away this one thing that I know I have and I'm developing on my own. And I'm wondering is as we're developing the skills and getting more actual autonomy because of the control we are getting over our lives,
Mhm.
if in your experience, does that make the PDA get more intense because we're getting more autonomy, or does it bring down the intensity of the PDA because we're being skillful?
That is a wonderful question. I think that So to be fair, I've only probably worked with like two people that might have identified with this if we had had the terms for this at the time I was working with them. So I
Yeah.
do want to say that. And I'm not, and this wouldn't be in the research anywhere. My gut reaction is it probably would depend on the context a little
Yeah,
bit.
totally, totally. Best answer.
Like, yeah,
Yeah.
in the sense of like, as you're growing more self-assured through therapy, maybe with folks with whom you feel really safe and secure, like your therapist,
Hmm.
the PDA, the drive or like the discordance might go down because you
Yeah.
trust this person more of like what they're suggesting to me is just a suggestion, not a demand, for
Yeah,
example.
totally.
But then in other contexts where you don't have that security, maybe it'll be the same, or maybe it'll even get worse because if you're kind of overcoming some conditioning of or trauma potentially of not having autonomy in
Yeah.
your life,
Yeah.
that then when you are growing the self-assuredness and you go out into the world, like maybe it'd be like kind of upped, at least for a little bit of time. So yeah,
Wow.
depends.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I think that's the most honest answer. It really will just depend on the context and the person.
Yeah.
I also would love to talk about opposite action for reducing shame. I recently have been learning about shame-informed therapy, specifically as an intervention, and I came
Mm.
across a study that was talking about how before children are 7 years old, they internalize the world that their parents have created as facts and true, and that even after that, if we unlearn those things, that the trauma of that truth still lives in our bodies. And that's how
Huh.
we internalize a lot of things as we get older and we let things go. And the longer
Mm.
you stay in some of those ideologies, usually they are dogmas, the harder it is to recognize where it is in your body versus your mind exactly. So, what is
Mhm.
it specifically about opposite action that can help reduce shame? And in what ways would we see that as like an effective treatment?
Totally. So I guess just in case for folks who are listening, opposite action is a skill from DBT that is like its entire purpose is to help you reduce emotions that you don't want to be feeling
Hmm.
by acting opposite to what that emotion makes you feel like doing. So,
Yeah.
like the very easy example usually is like anxiety and fear makes you feel like running away from something. And so, to decrease like phobias or ongoing anxiety, it often helps to approach things you're afraid of. And that helps you learn that that thing you're worried about hurting you isn't actually going to hurt you, isn't
Hmm.
actually dangerous.
Yeah.
So opposite action works like that, like across time. We can do the same thing with shame. So shame is an emotion of we are afraid of being socially excluded and isolated and rejected. And it often is based on kind of like what you're saying, like comes from a place of I am bad versus like I did a bad thing, like
Yeah.
guilt, like I am bad. And often the action urge with shame is to hide, is to isolate. And so that might be entirely hide, like all of myself,
Yeah.
or just hide a piece of me that is the quote unquote shameful part, according to people around me.
Yeah.
Um, and so what can be really useful in therapy is acting opposite to shame as the like primary focus of therapy and why it can be helpful in that kind of the way about like the body-based stuff you're talking about
Yeah.
is rather than just look, positive affirmations and self-validation are absolutely a part of of anti-shame work. And so often the thing that's going to make the bigger change is like the lived body experiences of being yourself, being out, not hiding whatever that part of you is there that's like shameful, quote unquote, again, and having people accept you, having people love you, getting positive feedback about yourself and about this part of you. So
Yeah.
this is why there's like pride for LGBTQ people. It is
Right.
being out and feeling the love and the support and the affirmation.
Yeah.
That is inherently like I don't need to challenge my negative thoughts for my body to start to believe that I'm actually okay because I'm
Yeah.
being told over and over and over without asking for it just by seeing the rainbows everywhere or
Right.
whatever the thing. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that, again, cognitive, challenging, and self-affirmations and all of that are a huge part of it. But I think opposite action, because of like that behavioral lived experience learning, is how it can be so powerful.
Wow. I love that. And have you experienced clients kind of overcoming shame by utilizing this skill?
I was nodding very emphatically, and then I was like, well, overcome. Like, we're all still gonna feel shame
Yeah.
every once in a while. In today's world, it's just like, first of all, shame is like so sticky.
Yeah.
There's
Good word
even
choice.
evidence to suggest that some people are like biologically born more predisposed to feel shame. So for those
Oof.
folks, it
Yeah.
might always be around to some extent. So you're not gonna like overcome it, as in you're never gonna feel shame again.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have personally seen this and have had tons of clients experience like huge shame weights lifted, if you will. All of a sudden, this thing that you woke up every morning looking yourself in the mirror and being like, oh God, like this thing, I hate this thing, what's wrong with me? All of a sudden, you're not doing that. And it's just, and then you find community and you have more friends and you, depends on what your shame is about and like where the growth happens, but it can be truly life-changing. And like shame doesn't become like your primary emotional experience.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And why is that so important for like the healing process to be able to tolerate and
Hmm.
we'll say mitigate, not overcome, like mitigate shame?
Yeah, man, why is that so important? I think because shame, as I said, is so, it's about who you are. Like those thoughts of like, I am bad, I am crazy, I am lazy, I am unlovable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like they are
Yeah.
all consuming and so painful. And so if we start to mitigate them and replace them with more accurate thoughts, I'm not even going to say positive, although they're often more positive, like
Yeah.
more accurate thoughts that you are okay exactly the way you are.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's few things more powerful than that. So,
I agree, and it leads me right into my next question, which is the tulip in a rose garden idea.
mm,
We've kind of already talked about pride, and I love that you brought that example up because it's really challenging for people to understand why it's such an important time period, or why Heritage Months are so important, or why recognition months are so important. It's like it is less about exclusion and more about celebration,
mhm,
therefore mitigating, lowering shame over an identity that you, in reality, and I don't like to use the word shouldn't be feeling shame over for to begin with.
yeah,
So this idea for people who aren't aware, Tulip in a Rose Garden and in DBT, Marcia tells the story of, you'd look around and discover actually you're not crazy, you're not stupid, you're not bad, you're not evil, you're not any of these things. You are a tulip in a rose garden. You're not with
yeah,
your people. So you go and you find other tulips. That story has a special place in my heart because I grew up at a part of Washington it is known for its tulips. It's called Skagit Valley. It has a tulip festival every year. In fact, if you go overseas to like the Netherlands, if you go to Japan, you might find the bulbs from Skagit Valley, not from.
wow,
Yeah, so it's very silly. And that years later, it wasn't until I was 28 that I even discovered DBT that I would find this metaphor so applicable to me because even while I was there, I felt like a tulip in a rose garden. Mind you, I
hmm,
didn't know that it was also because of the BPD symptoms that were just always below the surface. There
yeah,
was other things happening. So how does what we're talking about, right? Lowering and mitigating shame, being
hmm,
neuroaffirming, uh,
hmm.
being aware of what skills are needed when. How is that speaking to the metaphor of being a tulip in a rose garden? And like, how have you experienced that, right? Because like you've done DBT, you've lived DBT. I imagine in your life as you go through DBT, you also start to look around and go, rose, 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 where's my tulips?
Totally. Yeah. Um, I just have to say, this is such a gorgeous question because I do think that it it really provides the narrative of almost everything we've talked about so far today.
Yay.
So this metaphor comes as one of the teaching examples for the biosocial model that I mentioned earlier, actually. So there's this idea in the biosocial model that people start having difficulties with emotions, like the behavioral impulsive behaviors or just not understanding and knowing how to cope with emotions because of that biological emotional vulnerability, as we talked about. But then when you combine that with an invalidating environment, meaning the people around you communicate that that emotional sensitivity is like wrong or bad or too
Mm,
much or inappropriate or any X, Y, or Z negative thing.
yeah.
And we've started to understand that the biosocial model can actually apply to any inner experience. So not just emotions. So like queer desires or having a gender expression or identity different than the sex assigned at birth. And then also being neurodivergent in a neurotypical society. So being in that kind of situation where you're consistently getting messages that there's something wrong with you, that you're different, even just that you're different in like any kind of negative way, really adds up over time and makes people have mental health difficulties
Yeah.
or can be a contributing cause at least.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of a tulip and rose is like both are inherently beautiful. Both are biologically exactly what they are. And they both are perfectly fine the way they are, the way we just talked about in relationship to shame. But it's when they are surrounded by the other types of flowers or this cishet like societal expectations when you're LGBTQ or the neurotypical expectations when you are neurodivergent or when you are a person of color in a racist society, right? Like all of those things are going to lead up over time to feeling out of place. And so it's when you go into community, when you realize, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. There are other people like this. This is just how I am. It can create extreme growth, anti-shame, self-validation, all of these things we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Can you give everybody, if it's possible to, um, just some quick hits on how do I kind of troubleshoot in my life if I find myself
Mm.
in an invalidating environment? And let's say for this example, and I have the power to change that, right? I'm not going to include kids or people who are dependent on others and caregivers
Yep.
because that's a different conversation in itself. So people who find themselves usually in friend groups, right, that are invalidating or family settings that are invalidating, what would be your, right? We can't do therapy for the next hour, but if you could give somebody a 5 minute, hey, this is what I would suggest you do. Just look at these factors. If you mark yes on most of these, it's time to start evaluating how you're going to go and find that new soil that is more affirming to your identity.
Mm. Hmm. So I think that invalidation, maybe it's useful to define that quickly. It's like just the communication that your internal experiences don't make sense. At least that's
Oof.
the way we're talking about it in DBT. Yeah.
Yes. Say that. Can you say that again? That is
Yeah.
just, yeah, that
So
hits.
invalidation is the communication that your internal experiences don't make sense,
Mm,
that they're wrong or bad in some way.
yeah.
And that can come from a person, a family, a community, a society, as we just talked about.
Yeah.
So this might look like being someone might literally tell you this thing about you or this experience you've had. If you hear that you're bad, that you're wrong, that you're crazy, that you're lazy, that you're too much, like that is invalidation, period. So,
Yeah.
like, kind of check marks there. If you are consistently feeling less than, that's probably a sign that you're
Mm,
experiencing invalidation somewhere or have in your past.
yeah. Totally.
And then if you live in a society that has an ism against you,
Mm,
so we've talked about racism, we've talked about ableism, we can talk about sexism, heterosexism, transnormativity, of course. And then also, but also like sizeism and
yeah.
classism
Yeah.
and xenophobia
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all of the things,
Yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
you live in a society that in which you are a marginalized identity, then you are probably facing invalidation on
Right.
some level.
Right.
So that would be a cue for like kind of the big picture things that I can recommend without knowing someone's individual thing is like on one hand, practice the skill of self-validation, like broadly defined. And so I do talk about this in my book. It's from DBT. We have skills for that as a part of like the fast skills and interpersonal effectiveness. Um, but like, how can you say to myself, this experience I'm having makes perfect sense? and like just say, this is why it makes sense. Like dive into understanding why you are the way that you are, why you feel the way that you feel, why you do the things that you do. If you're feeling and doing something, there is always a reason. Finding it is going to be a big part of overcoming invalidation.
Mm,
Second thing is find your people. Like you
yeah.
said, find your tulip garden if you're a tulip, or find your roses if you're a rose. Like find the group of people who don't say those things to you, that
Yeah.
don't express the less than, the other, the othering, the whatever it is. Find the
Yeah.
people who have similar experiences to you, or at least actually who have the same experiences of you, or who accept you as you are, no matter if your experiences are the same or not. So
Totally. Yeah. And I appreciate that distinction, right? Because there are people who walk the middle path who have very different experiences, maybe even different worldviews than you entirely, and accept you
absolutely.
100% as you are, right? Like, yes,
Yeah.
I've run into both. I've run into the people who, and I myself do it as well. There are people who I'm like, no, can't accept. I'm not accepting that. I cannot look past this thing and fully accept you as you are without us addressing this thing first. And there are other people who
Mm,
I go, actually, I can overlook these things because of the way that you radically accept me as I am. I can return that favor in this regard because I don't feel any ulterior motive to your acceptance.
mm,
I feel like that's often overlooked too. Is like, is it radical? Am I being accepted because there's a motive to bring me into your worldview, or am I being accepted because you just love me as I am? You love the qualities of me as a person in your life that
mhm,
brings you value versus the end game of, well, if I just stick around long enough, they'll be more like me.
mhm.
Uh, kind of,
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because it makes me think about there's so many more examples than queer people, to be clear, but sometimes it's a useful thing, community to talk about for these
yeah.
questions. Like you can think about the hate the sinner, not the sin.
Sorry.
Like, sure. And you
Yeah,
can have kind, fulfilling relationships with those people if you are queer,
yeah.
if you share the same religion, or you have other connections that you want to share those relationships. And you may feel completely loved by them, and it will probably be helpful for you to find other people who don't think that's a sin. You know what I mean? Like to find the people who accept fully also.
I think about that a lot with sex. Like just when you start
Mm.
having those conversations with either friends or family, like so much cues come from you from a young age, like
Mhm.
what's inappropriate, what's dirty and bad, and what's acceptable and unacceptable.
Mhm.
And and it's such a kind of a powder keg topic because we are a Puritan-based society, shame-based society, and
Mhm.
sucks to suck. Uh, or
That's
with
fun.
radically accepting that this is the world I live in and how do I, move forward in that. Right?
Aha.
Like so,
Yeah.
and I want to be clear here, like I'm not I'm not suggesting people keep these people in their life because they can accept them. If they have a belief that is contrary to your worldview completely,
Mhm.
it might be time to review the interpersonal skills and see if this is a relationship that's interfering or if it's destructive.
Mhm.
And I'm
Mhm.
speaking DBT now. Would you help people understand what I mean by interfering and destructive?
Yeah. Yeah. So, one of the parts of interpersonal effectiveness is talking about how can we end relationships that aren't helpful to us.
Hmm.
And we think about destructive relationships as being the ones that are just like truly not, as long as we are in relationship with these folks, we cannot have like an enjoyable and or meaningful life.
Yeah,
While like interfering relationships are going to be more like the relationships that aren't destroying our happiness and well-being, but are negatively contributing some way, have significant problems, something like that. How can we, and then each person gets to decide, okay, is this something I'm going to problem solve and try to change the way this relationship is not supporting me and stay connected to this person? Or am I going to end this relationship? While meanwhile, for destructive, we lean towards that ending
yeah,
usually. Obviously,
yeah.
everyone still has to make their own decisions, but that's why we make this distinction of like abusive relationships are destructive and
Right.
yeah, for example.
Yeah.
And so making that distinction helps us feel more in power and control of recognizing even if I like this relationship or feel connected to this person for some reason, they still negatively impact me in this way. And so therefore, what am I going to do about it? And you have that choice point. Um, so yeah, I think what you're saying is accurate. Like each person gets to decide that for themselves, But I think if you're trying to overcome shame
Hmm.
about something specifically, or maybe in general,
Yeah.
you definitely want to find people who affirm, accept, and validate all of you, no matter what that thing is, even if you keep those other relationships.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Well, Kiki, we're wrapping up here, and I'd love it if I could just turn the mic to you. Do you have any questions for me about my DBT experience? And then before we go, I want to make sure I get some book recommendations from you as well. I'm often asked like, what are good books for X, Y, and Z? And we've talked about so many things from neurodiversity to shame-informed
Yeah.
approaches to opposite action. Like I'm sure you have. I mean, I see the books behind you. You've got great recs. They're there.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
suddenly
but
like, yeah.
but
Go
yes,
ahead.
turning the mic over to you for the next few minutes before we end. What can I speak to?
Yeah, I love that. My brain got distracted by books, but I will table that.
Story of my life.
So it sounds like I would love to hear. It sounds like you, first of all, I hadn't heard that 7-year-old research thing about the shame that you mentioned. Um, and you said that you learned that or you're looking that up in the context of the shame therapy or something that you're looking
Yeah,
into.
shame informed therapy. Yeah, so it's just psychotherapy that goes from the lens of how do I approach shame specifically.
Oh.
And it does use a bit of a biological social model as well. Like it references, like the study that I was reading, the article referenced Alice Miller, it referenced Bessel van der Kolk. So like things that we're familiar with who have been talking about body trauma for some time. But yeah,
Mm,
I've been interested in that I actually was just talking to my therapist about revisiting some of those books because when I was reading those books originally, I didn't know I had BPD. So I was just,
mm,
shooting blind hoping that something in these books, and what's interesting is something in each of those books made sense to me because that's just how identity disturbance is experienced.
mhm,
And it was deeply invalidating because I'd finish the book and be like, but why do I still feel like a piece of shit? Or like, why do I still feel sad or angry or dysregulated all the time?
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so yeah, that's where that came from.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna have to look that up, and maybe ask you to send me the research article that you mentioned too, specifically about the 7-year-old thing. I'd love
Yeah.
to learn more about it. Um, oh gosh, I mean, you mentioning Alice Miller and Vanderkolk just makes me think about the books too, and they are shame related, some of them. So I just adore Hillary McBride. Do you know her?
Hillary McBride. Wait, yes, I do know her. Is she a
She's
therapist?
a clinical psychologist. Yeah.
Yeah, does she have a
hmm
podcast?
I think she released one about religious trauma
Yes,
specifically.
isn't she friends with Science Mike?
Oh, I don't know.
I think we're talking about the same person because I Hillary McBride sounds like a very familiar name. In fact, I'm almost 100% positive I've listened to her podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, Hillary McBride is amazing. She has two books. One of them is a workbook, one of them is not, but both are about the wisdom of your body. They are fabulous. I recommend them to literally everyone who asks me for book recommendations, including clients, because they're just so applicable to so many people.
Yeah.
Um, I love her and I love them. And then the book that comes to mind, or rather like the author who comes to mind for me that I recommend related to neurodiversity is Devin Price. Devin is autistic and a psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, I don't believe, who has written a few books. I'm seeing if I can find the actual name. So yeah, Laziness Does Not Exist is a
Ooh,
fabulous one.
love that.
Uh-huh. And then they also have a book called Unlearning Shame
Okay.
and a book called Unmasking Autism.
Mm,
All of them are fabulous. And Devin has a Substack too.
okay. Hell yeah. Cool. Got it. Got him. I'm 99.9% sure I know who Hillary McBride is. I think I've listened to her podcast. Because back when I was more interested in exploring how to deconstruct from religious trauma, I feel like I stumbled into her podcast.
Yeah. I'm just realizing too, because I was looking up the names of the books, so I want to throw out there that Devin might use he, him pronouns, and so I apologize if that's the case.
Let's see. He,
Um,
him, just in case. Boom.
but Devin Price and Hillary McBride, I'd recommend it for everybody.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. I also realized that completely forgot to ask you about the difference between masking as an effective tool or as an
Huh.
ineffective tool versus other coping strategies for people and how you can learn to recognize whether or not you're masking. And then we'll end. But I didn't want to forget about that question.
I see, I see. Yeah. So I did a recent video exploring this idea of, so masking is a term that's most often talked about, or it's like it's used specifically in the autistic community to talk about hiding or trying to downplay autistic traits
Hmm.
or characteristic traits and behaviors that would be interpreted as autistic,
Yeah.
in order to operate and appear neurotypical,
Mm.
in society, for the reasons we just talked about, the ableisms, etc.
Yeah.
And and it gets at this idea that I think is common for a lot of folks who experience emotions intensely or struggle with emotions, that I need to hide parts of my experience and hide myself and my intensity and all of these things in order to function in society or in order to like fit in socially. So there's like an interesting overlap there for autistic and highly sensitive non-autistic folks. And it can be tricky. And so the thing that I think I talked about in the video that I'll offer again here for folks is like coming back to getting in touch with what is most important to me, what are my values, what are my goals,
Yeah.
and then really sitting with that. I don't want to downplay that that's an easy thing to do because a lot of times our goals and our values come from
Right.
our communities and our upbringing. And
Yeah.
so examining, is this something that is actually truly inherently important to me
Mm.
or just something I think should be important to me?
Yeah.
And sitting with that. And then everyone does things that they might have conflict or contradictory feelings about. This is part of the wise mind skill of like
Yeah.
balancing contradicting urges and
Yeah.
needs.
Yeah.
Everyone has those things, but so it can be effective sometimes to act opposite to desires, to hide certain inner experiences, or to downplay, express at different levels of emotions, for example.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between masking and hiding because I think I have to and I should, and in a way that causes me exhaustion and distress, versus choosing, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z things, or I'm not going to do, I'm going to hide this part of myself or mask this part of myself
Yeah.
in order to do something that's important to me, in order
Gotcha.
to fit in with people who matter to me. So I do think this brings us back to the shame conversation of like,
Yeah.
let's find people
Yeah. Yeah.
where you don't have to do that. And you still might have to do that like at your job or at school compared
Sure.
to at home or with friends or something like that.
I love that. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't want to lose that opportunity because that makes it gets talked about a lot on social media, and so I wanted to hear your perspective on
Yeah.
it.
Hmm.
Cool. Well, Kiki, I don't have anything else for you, and I'm so grateful for the time that you took to come on the show and just talk about everything we've talked about. It's so important. As you know, DBT can be a life-altering skill set and experiences. And now that I understand that it has these different levels, it could also be another avenue for people who are maybe more comfortable with their DBT therapist going into that tier one, tier two, or level one, level two we were talking about. So now people
Hmm.
know they have that option. Hey, if I want to go deeper with my DBT therapist, it doesn't have to be purely behavioral. I can now take that
Yeah.
next step. So I'm so happy we have that clarification. Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you. And to remind everybody, Kiki, can you show me the cards again and show me your book again? And I will put them in the description of the video as well so that people know. Woo!
Thank
Yes.
you so much.
Yes. Yes. So go order those DBT cards and the self-directed skills book. They are on Amazon and are they also on your website?
You can find links to them on my website. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Kiki, thank you so much, and I will be talking to you soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Loved this. Talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye.